Chapter 3. Malcolm the Healer, more widely known as Mallkallam the Black Sorcerer, looked up briefly from his work as Will rode into the little clearing in Grimsdale Wood. Each morning at 11 o'clock, Malcolm provided his people with medical treatment. Those with injuries or illnesses would line up patiently outside the healer's comfortable house so that he could diagnose and treat their ailments, sprains, cuts, sores, and fevers. Since many of the people who lived in the forest settlement had been driven out of their previous homes because of physical disabilities or disfigurements, there was usually a long line of patients. Many had ongoing health problems that required constant care. His last patient was a relatively straightforward case. An 11-year-old boy had decided to use his mother's doormat as a magic carpet while he attempted to fly from a 4-meter-high tree. Malcolm finished binding the resultant sprained ankle, put some salve on the scraped elbows and wrists, and ruffled the would-be adventurer's hair. "Off you go," he told him, "and from now on, leave the magic to me." "Yes, Malcolm," the boy said, hanging his head in embarrassment. Then, as he scuttled away, the healer turned to where Will was unsaddling his horse. The older man watched approvingly, noting the bond between the two as the ranger spoke gently to the animal while he rubbed it down. The horse almost seemed to understand his words, responding with a good-natured snort and a toss of its short mane. "I hear you found the Scandians, then," Malcolm said eventually. Will nodded. 25 prime fighting men, he said. "They were right where your messenger told us they'd be, on the banks of the river Ousel." Malcolm's people ranged far and wide through the vast forest. There was little that happened within its boundaries that they didn't see. And when they saw something out of the ordinary, they brought word to the healer. When reports had come in of a party of Scandian shipwreck survivors, Will had set out to find them. "And they were happy to offer their help?" Malcolm asked. Will shrugged as he sat down on the sunny veranda beside the old healer. "They'll be happy to receive the money I've offered them. Besides, their captain felt he owed me something because he let Buttle escape." Xander, the secretary and assistant to Ormond of Macindaw, came out of the house. "How's Ormond?" Malcolm asked. The castle lord had been poisoned by Keren in his attempt to gain control of Macindaw. Will and Xander had only just reached the healer's secret clearing in time to save his life. "He's much better, but he's still very weak. He's sleeping again," Xander said. Malcolm nodded thoughtfully. "That's the best medicine for him now. The poison's out of his system. His body can heal itself from here on. Let him rest." Xander looked doubtful. In spite of the fact that Malcolm had saved his master's life, he still viewed the healer with a certain amount of suspicion. He felt Malcolm should be providing more tangible treatment than the simple injunction, "Let him rest." But there was something else nagging at him at the moment. "Did I hear you say that you've offered to pay these Scandians?" he asked Will. Will grinned at him and shook his head. "No, I've offered to let you pay them," he replied. 70 gold royals for their services." Xander bristled at him indignantly. "That's outrageous," he said. "You had no right to do such a thing. Ormond is Lord of Macindaw. Any such negotiations were up to him, or me in his absence." The secretary had proven to be a brave little man and very loyal to his lord, but that could make him act like a bit of a prig at times. Will eyed him meaningfully. He heard Malcolm's snort of derision. "At the moment," Will said, with a warning note in his voice, "Ormond is lord of nothing very much at all, not even the borrowed bed he's lying in, so actually I outrank him. You seem to forget that I act with the king's authority." which Xander realised was true. Will was a ranger, after all, in spite of the fact that he had come to Macindaw disguised as a jongleur. It was difficult for Xander to accept that such vast authority could be vested in someone as young as Will. He backed off now, but still felt he had to bluster a little. "Even so," he said, 70 royals? Surely you could have done better than that." Will shook his head at the secretary's attitude. "You can renegotiate if you like. I'm sure the Scandians will be delighted to bargain with someone who'll sit watching while they risk their lives." Xander saw that he was on shaky ground, but he was too stubborn to simply admit it and let the matter drop. "Well, perhaps. But after all, it's their trade, isn't it? They fight for money, don't they?" "That's right," Will agreed, thinking that Xander could be a very annoying man. "And that gives them a pretty good idea what their lives are worth. Besides, look on the bright side. Maybe we'll lose, and then you won't owe them a penny." There was a hard edge to his voice that finally penetrated Xander's bumptious attitude. The secretary realized that it might be best not to pursue this matter any further. He sniffed and walked away, making sure that Will and Mallkallam could just hear his parting remark of, "70 royals indeed! I've never heard such extravagance." Mallkallam looked at Will and shrugged sympathetically. "I do hope you can get that man back in his castle before too long," he said. "One can tire of him very quickly." Will smiled. "Still, he's very loyal, and he can be a courageous little bantam, as you've noted." Mallkallam considered the fact for a few seconds. "It's strange, isn't it?" he remarked at length. "You'd expect qualities like that to make a person quite likeable. Yet somehow he manages to irritate the devil out of me." He made a brief gesture dismissing Xander as a subject of conversation. "So, come inside and tell me more about these Scandians of yours." He led the way inside the house, where he had a pot of coffee brewing. In the short time that he had known the young ranger, he had become aware of his near dependence on the drink. He poured him a cup now and smiled as Will tasted it, smacked his lips, and let out an appreciative sigh. The two settled into comfortable chairs at Mallkallam's kitchen table. "They'll be along in a day or two," Will continued. "I left them to pack up their camp and follow on. One of your people will guide them here. I must say we were lucky to find them. I'm going to need fighting men, and they're in pretty scarce supply." Mallkallam sighed. "True," he said. "My people aren't fighters. They're not trained or equipped for the job." "And the people from the villages around here would hardly join us. They're all terrified of Mallkallam the black sorcerer," Will said. He smiled to show there was no insult intended. Mallkallam nodded, recognizing the truth. "That's a fact. So, what do you plan to do when the Scandians get here?" The ranger hesitated before answering. "Then, we'll see. I'll have to figure out a way to take the castle and get Alice out of there." "Have you ever done that sort of thing before?" Mallkallam asked. Will grinned ruefully. "Not really," he admitted. "It never came up in my ranger training." He didn't want to dwell on it. He hoped that the Scandians might have some ideas on the subject, but he'd crossed that drawbridge when he came to it. Mallkallam stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Have you considered sending to Castle Norgate for help?" Will shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I have," he replied, "but Keren has the road sealed off. No riders are getting through." Mallkallam's observers had reported that riders heading west were being stopped and turned back. "Except his own," Mallkallam replied. "A rider left Macindaw while you were away." Will nodded gloomily. "Keren's no fool. I'll wager he's reported that Orman is a traitor and has run off, leaving Keren to keep Macindaw safe. That's what I'd do in his place. The trouble is, he's well liked and respected. they'll be inclined to believe him. Whereas I'm a stranger. What's more, I'm in league with an accused traitor and a known sorcerer. But you're a king's ranger, Mallkallam said. They don't know that. My presence here was a secret. Will laughed at the thought. Let's assume I could get a message through, and let's assume they don't dismiss it out of hand. What do you think they might do? Mallkallam considered for a moment. Send soldiers to help us? He suggested. But Will shook his head. It's winter. Their army is dispersed to their homes. It would take a couple of weeks to assemble them. It's a big undertaking, and they're not going to do that on a stranger's say-so. The best we could hope for is they might send someone to investigate, to find out who's telling the truth. And even that will take at least 2 weeks. It's a week there and another week back, after all. Mallkallam pulled a wry face. There's not much we can do, is there? We're not exactly helpless, Will told him. With 25 Scandians, we can cause Keren quite a bit of trouble. Then, once I have some concrete evidence, we'll send word to Norgate. He paused, frowning heavily. He wished he was a little more experienced in matters like this. He was the most junior ranger in the corps, and, truth be told, he was uncertain that he was taking the right path. But Holt had always taught him to gather as much information as possible before taking action. For the 20th time in the past few days, he wished he could contact Holt. But Alice's pigeon handler seemed to have disappeared from the district. Run off by Buttle and his men, most likely, he thought gloomily, then shook off the negative thoughts with an effort. So, what else has been going on while I've been away? He asked. He drained his coffee and looked hopefully at the pot. Mallkallam, who was aware that his supply of coffee beans was running low, studiously ignored the hint and the quiet sigh that followed it. He shuffled through a few sheets of notes that he had taken when his spies had reported in. There were a couple of things, he said. Your friend Alice has been showing a light at her window for the past 2 nights. That news took Will's mind off the coffee, he noticed. The young man sat straight up in his chair. A light, he said eagerly. What kind of light? Mallkallam shrugged. Looks like just a simple lantern, but it moves around the window. From corner to corner? Will asked. Mallkallam looked up from his notes, surprised. Yes, he said. How did you know that? Will was smiling broadly now. She's using the courier's signal code, he said. I guess she knows that sooner or later I'll be watching. When does she do this? Mallkallam didn't need to consult the notes this time. Usually after midnight watch has changed, around 3 in the morning. The moon's well down by then, so the light is easier to make out. Good, said Will. That gives me time to get a message prepared. I'm a little rusty on the code, he added, apologetically. Haven't had to use it since my 4th year assessment. You said there were a couple of items, he prompted. Mallkallam shuffled the pages again. Oh, yes. One of my people saw Buttle and his men talking to a warrior by Tumbledown Creek the other morning. He thought they might be recruiting him, but the warrior seemed to send them packing. Then he rode off himself. I believe he's taken a room at the Cracked Flagon. This news was less riveting, Mallkallam saw. Will, his thoughts already composing a message to Alice, asked absently, Could your man make out the warrior's blazon? A blue fist. He was a freelance. Had a blue fist on a white shield. A round buckler. That piece of news definitely engaged the ranger's attention. He looked up quickly. Anything else? Was he young or old? Quite young, apparently. Surprisingly so, in fact. A big fellow, riding a big bay. My chap was close enough to hear him talk to the horse. Called him Nicker, or Wicker, or something like that. Kicker? said Will, a giant ray of hope dawning inside him.
Yes, that could be it. Makes more sense than Nicker, doesn't it? Do you know him? He added.
From Will's delighted reaction, it was obvious that he did. Oh, I think I might, he said. And if it's who I think it is, things just took a big turn for the better.